All right, I'm not sure, we lost Ross for a minute here. He'll be running back in, but let's go ahead and get started. Your time is valuable here. Thank you so much for coming in the second session here for the Emerging Technologies Business Continuity Disaster Recovery. So we have our panelists, and you can see up there, Michael Cruz, Gary Coverdale talked to us the first session here, and this one, we're gonna have Bryan Zanoli and Jerry Creekbaum. Talking to us more on the technology side and the emerging technologies that's available to us going forward. So I will turn it over to our esteemed panel.
Let's see, who's next? I think it's Jerry.
Got the first one here.
Okay, so the way this session is going to work is we'll go over just a few slides, and then we'll have more of an interactive conversation with you as we go through here. But I just wanted to touch on a few points to maybe provoke some thought as we get into the details. So, as mentioned, my name's Jerry Creekbaum. I'm with Verizon. I'm a Tier 3 engineer within our disaster recovery network, if you will, supporting our own clients as well as our own network. So we've got a large disaster response team that we deploy for the community and the public during a disaster, as well as supporting our clients. So we get a unique visual experience of seeing not just our own environment, but understanding what goes on with different verticals, different groups of customer sets in different situations, right? From not just fires and earthquakes, but tornadoes, flooding, and other environments. So it gives us a little different view, and I just wanted to maybe touch on a few of the points that we see out there from our side of the house, if you will. So one of the things that I just wanted to throw out there is would your network survive, right? And we've talked about situations where there's a major fire, it may be affecting power, and you've got to relocate physically. But let's say your building is fine, right? There's been a major event. It could be flooding or a tornado or something miles away, but it's affected a central office somewhere, or it's affected that fiber path somewhere along the line, and now you're cut off. Your building's fine, but you're cut off from your network. So what would you do? And it's really about looking at multiple options, not relying on a single path for your communications. We've talked about disaster recovery in data centers, but you need to have thought into your last mile and your regional access, right? And this example was Moore, Oklahoma, and I thought it was appropriate with what we're seeing in Oklahoma and the central part of the states going on right now, with all the the news of hurricanes going on up in St. Louis, Oklahoma, down into down into Texas. And this was an example of one of our customers. This is a real site that was deployed. And while it doesn't look very pretty right now, that satellite system was in operation after that tornado went through. And that was an EF5, the highest rated tornado that you can have. It didn't hit the building directly, but obviously it was close enough to cause some wind damage in the area. But just wanted to get you thinking about options outside of the normal telecommunications infrastructure. So you want to have your high-speed fiber going into the facility, but when you're looking for business continuity, you want to look at options. Just wireless, satellite. There's been discussion of internet-based access technologies as well. You want to just take a broad view of what your infrastructure looks like, and just understand in your environment here in California, if there was to be an earthquake, how would that affect you? If you've had a plate shift where it's a major disruption for buried cable, would your primary and secondary path work? If you've got a secondary path that's going across broadband internet, where's that going into your building? It's going through the same conduit typically in most cases, right? So if you've got a break in that fiber, break in that cable, or the central office is affected, chances are it's affecting your backup circuit as well. Wireless gives you some diversity, but again, it's not completely independent of that local infrastructure. You're wireless to the tower, but from that tower, you're going back into the ground, going back into the terrestrial network. So just thinking about those things. And then, this is an example of a proactive business continuity approach. That system was sitting there waiting for a disaster to happen. When the site was affected, it automatically switched over. But in the first responder area, you can't really make it out here, but there's actually a satellite truck here that's more of a reactive system where the events happened. This particular building was damaged, the other one wasn't. They're going into the area and they're assessing the damage, and then in some cases they're mobile offices on wheels where you can establish an emergency center in that trailer. You've got your servers in the trailer, you've got your air conditioning, heating, your tools that you would normally do to start business or to get things going on the ground so you can get your people back into a facility, or you can plug it into the facility when you park next to it so you can establish connectivity. The other aspect of things, just kind of keeping on that same theme, is really the flooding, right? So I know here in California you go from one extreme to the other, right? It's extremely dry and arid, and then all of a sudden you've got major flooding because it has been dry for so long. When you do get rain, you start having flooding and mudslide issues. One of the things that we noticed in Hurricane Sandy out on the East Coast is it really wasn't the hurricane that affected most customers and most services. It was the flooding associated with the rain that came along with that hurricane. So it wasn't wind damage that you would expect. And with New York, as you probably know, they've got massive tunnels, subway systems. Most of the communications is underground. When you've got flooding, where's the water going, right? It's going into the tunnels, into the cableways and things of that nature. So again, in an environment like that, the FCC, after everything was done, they reviewed what went on, and their research revealed that 25% of the cellular networks and cable networks within 10 states were down. So they had lost that much communications, within in that area during the disaster. And a lot of it with flooding, it's going to be down for a while. It isn't something you can quickly fix. You've got to drain the water, and then you've got to repair the cable. And in many cases, in the case of copper, you're having to replace all of that cable with fiber, right? Or you're not just replacing a piece of it. You're replacing large sections because of salt damage and things of that nature. So it's just, I wanted to show a couple slides here just to get the thought process going as far as, your thoughts towards business continuity, and then we'll kind of get into to these in more detail in a second. But when we talk about access, really in this slide, it's Verizon in general. I wanted to just show you a slide to see what I'm talking about. This could be any telecom carrier, right? But when you're looking for your business connectivity, you want to look at your options. You do have options for Ethernet access, TDM access, traditional connectivity, but you also have cellular, satellite, and DSL type options. But you want to go back into a private network from a high availability standpoint. That private network is going to give you the most protection in a disaster. If you're using a lot of broadband during a disaster, you're oftentimes competing against the public, right? So it's a shared resource, public broadband connectivity. And then in a disaster, what does everyone do? They're searching the internet to get more information about the disaster. It's one of the same problems we see on the cellular networks is the call loading that happens after a disaster. Oftentimes, it's not that a tower was affected by the disaster. it's the overload of resources when you have a larger number of entities trying to access that network. So we do stress private networking to look at options, and that private networking is available for wireless technologies as well as satellite technologies. So you can access that private network from whatever medium you're working on. And the other benefit that that's going to give you is, as was discussed in the earlier session, is you're not deploying something new in a disaster. You're able, if you're leveraging the same MPLS network or private network that you would have at your home office, when you have a disaster, all of those same resources that were available to you in your home office are now available wherever you go, whether it's a satellite connection, a wireless connection. You're able to get to that same server that you were accessing in your office. You're able to get to the same cloud services. Off of this network, you could be connected into, a secure cloud interconnect or a private network off of it. So it's allowing your end users the ability to really have that commonality and familiarity with their network resources when they are deployed. And then lastly, for my area is just, my specialty is satellite communications. I've been doing it for 28 years now with Verizon and 6 years with military SATCOM before I joined Verizon. And it's not a one size fits all. It depends on what you're looking for, whether it's an antenna system on top of your EOC or your business operations, your admin office, so that you never lose connectivity, down to a mobile system that's in a case or in a vehicle or whatever the case may be. You size it to your requirements, and I'm showing you a few different options here. The center one down here is a mobile command center from a sheriff's department here in California, so that they can maintain their communications when they go out onto the desert looking for someone. There's certain areas where you may go outside of wireless coverage, and you want to have that protection. Any of you guys on the security side of the house, you're familiar with the term, defense in depth, right? This is protection in depth, where you're layering on options so that you can maintain that connectivity so that you're not out of touch.
So let me just throw some couple things. We're going to have Bryan come on up here. But you guys, there's a common theme right here, and I want to make sure when we get into some additional questions later that the biggest thing that he shared with you is access. If you have not pre-planned how you're going to make that happen and tested it, you will have problems. These were just some ideas of what we've done. Again, different disasters have different responses and different ways to plan for it, but definitely make sure, again, when you get into those planning stages, that you've also looked at what others have done. We talked about the ability to look as an experience from your partners, but also from the earlier session, was some of your like agencies, like counties and cities, and figure out what they're doing across the nation. I mean, you saw some of the experiences here. It may happen in Louisiana, but we have been having, I don't know if anyone knows where Lake Berryessa is, but we just happened to see some water spout, little tornado over our little old lake, and I live out that direction. So I don't want to say bad weather's coming your way, but be prepared for it when it does. That being said, Bryan.
All right. Morning, everybody. As you mentioned, my name is Bryan Zanoli, and I'm principal architect with Entisys 360. I specialize in end-user compute, so my background is, the Citrix, Zen Desktop, Zen App, the VMware, Horizon, Microsoft Remote Desktop Services. It's a solution that a lot of high availability thoughts and ideas need to be brought into, right? So my designs, I'll give you some examples. So in addition to our wonderful public sector customers, we deal a lot with healthcare and with finance. Both of those are very much focused on two of probably the most important things to most people, which is money and their lives, right? So these solutions that I build out for these customers, downtime just can't happen. It's not a question of a few minutes in some cases, but there needs to be an instant capability to fail over even if an entire data center goes down. So there's a few strategies and a few configuration details that go into how to design that. So first, I'd like to dive into something on kind of the network layer. So these are things that I incorporate into my designs when working with customers, and it really comes away from what Jerry was mentioning on the transport layer, taking into account network communications. And we've got what is the software-defined WAN. So link aggregation on the WAN level isn't necessarily a new technology, but software-defined WAN in its current iteration really is. And the reason why this makes so much sense and such a big difference is you've got your data center to remote office or your data center to data center connections. Let's use the remote office as an example, in which you've got to connect back to your main data center in order to access data applications. You know, maybe even your VoIP servers are located in your data center. Well, if you do backup links, occasionally, you know, you've got, of course, your MPLS high SLA connection back to your data center. But if you do backup links, sometimes there's some time to fail over there. And if you're really trying to deliver that always-on availability, something like this means I connect to my broadband DSL cable connections here. And because I've got a point-to-point, as you can see, the SD-WAN appliance is on either side. Because I have this point-to-point connection between the two, these devices are able to determine what's going on either end of the connection. So as the frames are passing through either side, it knows, let's say SD-WAN appliance on the data center communicating to the remote office here, it sends that frame through the MPLS connection. It now knows, because it calculates how much time is taking for it to get through, it now knows the latency of the MPLS connection, and it now knows the latency of that broadband connection. Not only can we do it with broadband DSL and cable, but we can add the satellite connections to it, the wireless connections, and you can aggregate all of this together, and it balances it across the network so that not only are you seeing the instant failover capabilities, but also the performance of being able to bring those networks together and leverage all of your available bandwidth, not just the primary connection, right? So now what this can mean, though, is that some customers might take a look at this and go, well, I can throw AT&T DSL at it, I can throw Comcast cable at it, maybe throw in a Verizon little MiFi as backup, and that's all that I need. As Jerry mentioned earlier, that's especially not the case during a disaster, because although if something happens and we sever that connection on the MPLS, you'll have a backup broadband. It's not ideal to rely exclusively on those congested public networks during the case of a disaster. You know, it's really important that we make sure that we have those private networks with dedicated SLAs that are going to give us that guaranteed uptime that we need. Now, of course, we'll probably want to use the satellite and the wireless connections, because during a disaster, it's possible, even if your data center is still up and even if your remote office is still up, that somewhere in between, the data center struck something that just took out the network interlink, right? So that's a key part of the transport layer. How do you keep two separate data centers connected? Now let's look at something one layer up from there and talk about the infrastructure. So I want to bring up metro clusters. If you've been in IT for a while and done anything with storage, you'll know that metro clusters are in no way new. They've been around for quite a while. And just a brief recap on how they work. You've got two separate sites. There are limitations for these sites, such that they have to be connected by a link with less than 10 milliseconds of latency. So you're not exactly going to get across the United States with these two site deployments. It's pretty much limited to within about 100 miles. So because the storage is being replicated across these two sites at that bottom of the infrastructure layer there, if anything happens to that single site, we've got the virtual platform deployed over that storage infrastructure. We've got hosts deployed on either side, and those VMs are accessing storage that is shared all the way across the two data centers, that stretched cluster. Different storage vendors have different ways of approaching this. Some, you'll actually have the VMs in Site 1 accessing Site 1, and the VMs in Site 2 accessing Site 1 storage through the controllers in Site 2. So it actually gets redirected through. Some, it's actually fully split across, and this is especially the case in the newer hyper-converged deployments of the metro clusters, in which the storage is, because it's replicated everywhere, and because it's location aware, the VMs are accessing that storage in that specific site. So, what happens in the case of a site failure? Site 1 goes down, those VMs crash. There's really no way to take care of that. We can't do predictive VM migrations, but what will happen is when those VMs shut down or powered off, it'll be recognized by the VM host through the built-in virtual high availability, and those VMs are then restarted on Site 2. So you may experience a brief outage. There may be a little bit of cleaning up to do when those VMs do come back online, but they are going to be there and available within anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour. All right? So this is absolutely huge if what you're working on, if what this infrastructure is supporting is critical to the organization. This just meant that you're back up and running definitely within the same day, right? And that can be a huge advantage. So let's say that the metro cluster either is overkill or it's just a little bit too expensive to implement. In a lot of cases, if you're talking about taking the entire data center and applying something like this to every single resource, every single server, it can get a little bit pricey. So how do we deal with that when instead we're going to fall back on older technologies like backups and replication? Software-defined networking can step in there because the number one problem with replicating your virtual machines over to another data center, if you're ever involved in doing that, you'll know, is the issue with IP addresses. Once that virtual machine comes over, it's in a new network because you need to keep those networks disparate on those disparate data centers, right? You don't want any kind of overlap. So once that virtual machine comes over to that second network, it's talking in a completely different IP address range. That's easy. That's already been solved by a lot of these technologies. They simply just re-IP that virtual machine for you. But then you're talking about updating DNS, right? And there's a lot of convergence time and propagation time with that. So you're still down for anywhere from 4 to 8 hours as you're waiting for all of that stuff to kind of gel up and be accessible. Well, software-defined networking takes that completely away because now we can still do that same replication, but because the networks are mapped across, that virtual machine, when it comes back up, is already on that same network. And with this, you don't have to actually connect the networks. There's no routing that takes place between Site 1 and Site 2 that gets you from this, let's use VLAN 101 and VLAN 101 on the other side. There's no routing that has to take place to get you through from one side to the other. It's the virtual infrastructure, the network virtualization, that takes care of that for you, right? So what this also means is this can be fully managed and maintained by whoever the virtualization administrator is, whoever the data center administrator is, without having to worry about what's in between. And now finally, we touched a lot on the transport and the infrastructure layers. I just want to briefly go over applications and data and some of the stuff that I've seen, since this is very much, it ties very much into what it is that I do and I have to take into account in the designs, is applications versus data and how to manage those properly. A well-designed EUC or remote workplace environment is going to have applications available at any time. So if we go back to that dual site topology that we were looking at before, I can very easily set up a remote workplace in both of these sites that has, let's say, Microsoft Office installed in each one. A user logs into site 1, they have Microsoft Office, they've got Word right there. Same thing if they log into site 2, Word's available right there as well. The problem becomes, well, how do I get the data in site 1 available on site 2? And so there's specific considerations that I keep in mind depending on what level of availability is required by the organization. For example, user profiles are something that we deal with consistently in the EUC space. And these user profiles are just the customizations that you make whenever you log on to, your Windows or your Windows desktop. Any of those changes that you make are saved in that profile. Well, some of that information, some of those customizations, let's say you have custom menu items in Microsoft Word, aren't really necessary in the case of a disaster, right? It takes maybe a half an hour to an hour to reconfigure your environment when in the middle of a disaster, that's not really what you're after. You're after just getting that document, that Word document specifically. You don't care so much about the user profile, right? So a lot of times, we won't even bother with doing any kind of backups of user profiles because in the case of a disaster, your first priority is the data and the data only. And we'll just worry about making sure that there's a mechanism in place to replicate that data across. On top of that, user profiles are a very, very fast access. If we're going to replicate it, we have to have near synchronous replication taking place. Synchronous replication, really, really expensive, not something we want to do very often. Asynchronous replication of data through things like distributed file systems or even storage replication, that's much cheaper, much easier to do, right? And so those kind of compromises are consistently taken into account. But the key thing with that is applications are easy to provide access to. Data is a whole lot tougher to provide access to. But you really want to prioritize that data and what you're going to do to make that available and determine whether or not all of the data truly is required in the case of a DR scenario. All right?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bryan.
Absolutely.
Before we get into our comments and questions and we actually be able to talk to Michael and Gary of how they would apply some of this stuff, I kind of look at this and go, what did we learn from it? One, it's complex. For those that are not highly technical in the room, I got my hand on up. There's a whole lot. And I know sometimes it's difficult to listen to some things that have that level. But for those that really are able to grasp some of these different technology concepts behind it, it's something that you really need to think about in advance, right? You need to get your own internal teams to educate them. I didn't even say go to a partner yet, but really start looking at what these models mean to your organization. How can they proliferate? Because if you look at a model that works today without a disaster and provides the same exact experience into a disaster for all of those workers that are doing emergency response, you're going to have a much easier time when you actually come into those situations. So that being said, we have 2 areas, I should say 4 areas, right? Access, infrastructure, data, and applications with some of the technologies here. What I want to do is I'm going to kind of pass this to Michael and Gary and to talk about, or share, I should say, some of the things that you guys could have done different based upon some of these things we've shared today.
Well, I think the first thing was, if you weren't here for the first session, I mentioned one of our biggest challenges was moving from the State Operations Center to a completely cold site. And I also mentioned quickly that one of our biggest challenges was, we moved all the state and local personnel to a new facility. Well, in the State Operations Center, they had access to all their data. Our data center is there actually in the State Operations Center on premise. And you move to a completely new facility, they didn't have access to that data anymore. Critical files that they'd been working on before FEMA arrived that they needed, whether it's simple templates or forms, but there was declarations, other things they were working on they didn't have access to. And me as the ISO, I cringed, obviously, when they said, okay, we're moving to the joint field office, and everyone's putting they're taking all the data off the state operations center domain, shared drives, and they're putting it on thumb drives and portable drives, and I'm just thinking, okay, and they're reintroducing it to a brand new sterile environment that's going to be in the joint field office. And unfortunately, one of the lessons learned we look back now is, there was a discussion on, well, we just started O365, let's leverage one of the shared sites and let's move everything to that, and it'll authenticate folks through Microsoft and so forth. Well, it's a whole new technology, something none of the users were familiar with. The most important thing you need to think about is user experiences. For your users' experience is that it doesn't change, particularly in a disaster. What they do on their everyday workstation should be no different when they start working in a disaster. And that was our biggest challenge. Obviously, I think leveraging some type of technology where it was already replicated, particularly on the cloud where they already get access, that would have been very beneficial for us, because I think our biggest challenge is data. It's okay, you need to get access to that data, because in a disaster, you can get your infrastructure back up and running, you can get the workstations out there for people to use and everything else, but if they don't have access to their data, that starts proposing new threat vectors, particularly for an ISO like myself, is like, okay, now we're introducing new possible problems, malware, whatever people may be introducing into the network. I think that was one of our biggest ones right there, with the JFO. Yeah. Yep. I don't think this is on, so you just got to talk loud. Or is it?
Hello, testing now. So you mentioned, I mentioned about our moves and all that, but, and I also mentioned the point 1 or point 2 that would have pancaked our data center. And so I think it's really important to leverage either the cloud or a physical hot site, and leverage it into your production model to minimize the financial costs to your budget. So with your virtualized environment and virtualized data, and develop an active, passive, active model that will leverage the production hot site as not only a DR recovery failover, but also a fully production site, and with some distance between the two sites or into the cloud. I think that's a very logical and reasonable answer to a DRBC project. So,
Question. Did you give him a kiss? Oh, those that weren't here earlier. Ben was giving out kisses for questions, but of course they're Hershey's kisses.
Deterring people from actually asking questions?
I think my biggest challenge with VR is getting the funding to do it. It usually occurs after something has happened somewhere else that I would get the funding. What would be your approach in approaching management with getting funding? Even if I've done cost analysis for them, I've done risk analysis for them, and they go, you want 50,000 for this? 50,000? I could buy this new toy instead. It's like, because the disaster recovery, disaster might happen once every, 5 years, 10 years. So they don't worry about this stuff. What would be your suggestion?
Beautiful question, right? That's kind of key. I'm gonna pass this to Michael, but again, guys, this is one of the hardest questions. You can come up with the absolute best plan in the world that's going to impact you and give you the best results. But
Technology is easy.
yeah,
Management is difficult.
absolutely, yeah. It is. It's the managing up aspect of it, right? So, Michael, can you comment?
Oh my goodness! You know what? It's easier for me to convince our management that it's critical because it's our
You're in the
life,
business,
it's our job, it's our business. So, but let me reference back to some previous experiences. I think although my entire career I've been around IT. I was a network engineer early in my days, and then eventually I went to business school and got and learn more about particularly how does a technology specifically work for a business, particularly for your organization? Because one thing I've noticed in my years is, particularly speaking with management and asking for something, is once you bring in acronyms or start talking about technology, their eyes will glaze over and they'll automatically shut you out. I think if you spend enough time putting a business case, and you've mentioned analysis and things of that nature, I've gotten to a point where I've said, not necessarily kind of threatening, but do you really want to find yourself in a situation where you're standing in front of a camera with bright lights and you're trying to ask questions, particularly regards to why didn't you take these protective measures? Why didn't you do this and do that? Where was the due diligence? And be persistent, but don't be annoying, but definitely be persistent, but and don't be threatful, but but I think putting it in a case of where you try and explain to your management why this is critical and what are the ramifications and consequences is usually has worked for me in the past. And just make sure you document it. That's the most important thing, because I currently, I do ask for a lot of things, and security is expensive. And I understand I'm competing against other business units within the organization for those limited resources. And all I can do is say, hey, these are the risks. I'm asking, and I document it. And then that way, if something does happen later down the road, I can always say, okay, well, I did my due diligence. Just make sure you do yours.
I'd like to add to that as well. So, in certain cases too, these technologies that we're working with, like the ones I shared, like SD-WAN, right? That's something that you can leverage on a day-to-day basis. It offers that capability to fail over, and it's an instant failover. But every day you're using it, you now have the ability for remote apps to not only access through your MPLS private network, which may be, because it's a remote office, you only want 3 megs a second. You got 10 users out there, you don't really care. You can also add the Comcasts or the AT&T DSLs out there and increase greatly for very minimal cost the amount of bandwidth you're getting off of it. And so you get a total pipe that's way, way larger, and you still have the availability of the backup of the MPLS network, right? So you're getting definite benefits with added disaster recovery capabilities. Same thing with hyperconverged storage, like I mentioned with the Metro cluster. A lot of these storage platforms it's just a feature that's already built in. You just have to have the additional site. Sometimes that can be just somewhere across the street. Sometimes it can be within the same data center on opposite sides of the data center. You just have to determine where that availability is. And if you can leverage other partnerships to, say, share resources in another county or another city, that also helps a lot, right? So it's not just looking at exclusively what it takes to make something a disaster recovery solution, but also the features it offers on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I would say I completely agree. I mean, what we see from our side, talking with other customers, you've got two different views, right? If you view it as strictly a disaster recovery budget, that can be a challenge sometimes. It's an insurance policy, right? But if you're using it to augment your day-to-day operation and improve the performance, you're looking at a different budget, and you're able to reduce the overall cost of business continuity, right? Because you're sharing it across multiple avenues. And one area we see a lot, and they even mentioned it today in the keynote, was guest Wi-Fi, right? If you've got a guest Wi-Fi project, you can leverage that broadband connection for the Wi-Fi as an alternate backup path for your day-to-day operation with something like SD-WAN. Now, I talked earlier about the pros and cons between private networking and public networking. Broadband public networking is fine, it does work, but there's multiple levels of business continuity, and private network is going to be your highest level. But if you're trying to get some business continuity going, Something's better than nothing, and being able to leverage, those other projects to help the end goal.
A couple of years ago, we had copper from AT&T thieves out of Fairfield, and as they were pulling the copper, they destroyed the fiber, and it took our ISP services down for 2 days, which is just, everybody's in a frenzy. So that initiated a failover, additional ISP, Internet Services Provider, with automatic failover, which is a little complex to deploy, but we got it deployed, and so that was our initial step into thinking about failover and duplicity and all that. But you really got to get the C-suite people thinking about it. There's HIPAA regulations that require DR and BC, and other regulations that require BC and DR. So it's just an educational process, and bake into your budget, depending on what your size is. We bake in our budget $200,000 for IT for security, and a lot of that security is for DR and BC with security baked into it too. So but it's a struggle. And we talked about this at our conference 2 weeks ago. We had a complete session on how to get support of your C-suite people, CEOs, CAOs, and also so forth, and the board, to support DR and BC. So it's an uphill battle, no doubt.
Questions? Yes.
So you talked about private network. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because to me, the disaster I'm thinking of is something goes down, we can't go to the office to work. People are going to access our resources probably through some sort of public internet to get to our private. So I'm trying to figure out how does that actually, the private network, help in the disaster area where people can't come in?
Bryan,
Yeah, so you can get wireless devices that directly access your private network, but there most certainly will be some situations where you need to do a VPN tunnel. But one thing that we try to stress is from an overall business continuity planning process, you want to try to eliminate the things that are outside of the normal day-to-day. So when you've got a solution, you're bringing into a building, you're supporting 600 people, you want them to be able to sit down and do their day-to-day operation. If you do have a situation where people are working remote from home, that very well may be where you're establishing a VPN tunnel into that private network. But there are services out there that allows that VPN tunnel to access your private network without having to terminate that connection into your data center. So if you're today, you've got to set up for your personnel to work from home, and they're tunneling back into your data center. If that data center goes down, you can no longer tunnel back into it, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to have sort of a cloud-based VPN service going into that private network, so that even if the data center goes down, they get in the private network, and that'll allow them to hit your DR site or your backup site. But the advantage of that private network really is around, situations of disasters where the public networks are typically overloaded. A good example is pandemics, right? We're talking major disasters here, fires, flooding, earthquakes. Pandemic the network is fine. It's the change in traffic patterns that have now caused congestion points. And when you're on those public networks, those are some situations you have to just be aware of. If you wanted to.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think you got it.
Question.
Wouldn't you say you want to leverage multiple site providers? You wouldn't want to just leverage, say, Verizon for all your traffic? You would want to have AT&T or Verizon or Sprint and maybe even contracts with them, even if you're not going to use them, established in place in case there's an emergency situation where one of those site providers is not an accessible point of reference.
And
Yes.
the key point is established ahead of time, right? Trying to establish services in the middle of a disaster can be a true challenge,
Right.
but, yeah.
And you can utilize those relationships in production, in load balancing. There's no reason why you can't use it in production all the time, so it's always there. And there are automatic failovers that you can configure into those, depending on what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
What's really cool is like with SDN, you can do application prioritization and be able to take, say if you have two diverse networks, and be key, guys, two diverse networks, if they're both going in the same MPO, right, it's the same backhaul tractor that goes in and takes it all out. But if you happen to have, say, an SDN in place, just like Gary said, you can actually put different things across different, different pipes, in matter speak. It's, what's really cool about what you're hearing on up here, and this is kind of the lessons that through my experience, is if you can put in a program that works on your day-to-day basis and improves the business, okay, the business outcome of today, that has the ability to create a level of impact in case of those emergencies, the business case starts to make light in itself. I mean, you start to see that light at the end of the tunnel. The additional items that you're going to find where you need to justify the business aspects is when you say, look what happened in Napa, look what happened with the fires, look what happened in New York, and you start going through these and you say, look, here's what has actually occurred. Here's where in our own state, I won't mention the agencies that have been in front of the press, right? And we've seen them. Somebody has to get on up there, they're batting their eyebrows and on their forehead, and they're trying to respond to what did they put in place, right? This type of preparation for those that may not know around HIPAA compliance and the things that are required. If you fail to do anything, you're more at risk for penalty and leaders of those organizations to go to jail, I did say jail, than those people that try and put things in place and fail. That's okay, but you have to do something. So it gets scary if you don't put things into place. And you can share those business outcomes, quite negative, because remember, we are just running businesses. Even though it's the public sector, we're running businesses. Our customers are the constituents of the state of California or in the cities and counties. So we have to really look at it from that aspect and say, what could those negative impacts be back to ourselves?
Yeah, and real quick, a great example of something to speak exactly to that and getting out in front of these solutions. I recently did a design of an EUC solution inside of Amazon, right? And as part of this deployment, you have multiple management components and whatnot that are required in order for everything to stay function. Well, if you're talking about an environment where 5,000 users are going to connect to, and it's in the cloud, well, Amazon already has multiple data centers that you can leverage, multiple availability zones, but you want to know what you're going to be doing before you even start the deployment of it, because if you can get out ahead of it, I was able to split up the management components between the two availability zones. Maybe the same region, and maybe if the entire region goes down, that whole environment goes down, but of course we can even account for that by expanding to another region. But at least knowing, hey, I'm going to split up because the application, the solution itself has its own built-in capability for high availability. I'm going to split it across these two availability zones at the beginning, at the time of deployment, before we're even worrying about having the disaster recovery conversation. So that way, if anything does happen to a single data center, I know I'm covered.
You got a question?
Yeah, my question was to the last presentations, coming back to the June network topology.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about applications, infrastructure, and data,
Yep.
but we didn't highlight much more security. So my question is, since I know you talked about SDN, that networks are mapped across.
Correct.
So if we, and we talked about the cloud VPN coming into the private network, isn't that a how do we compromise security, because VPN is not secured, right?
You definitely want to set up something like an IPsec tunnel in order to secure the traffic that's being thrown across that network, especially if it is a public network. And connections into the cloud are the exact same thing, right? You're typically leveraging public networks to get to the cloud. You can get direct private connections to Amazon or Azure, but they're a lot more expensive. So you're using a VPN connection. So yeah, securing that connection is crucial.
But I guess to follow on to that, there are options like you mentioned. We call it secure cloud interconnect in our world, where instead of going to Microsoft through the public network, you're going to Microsoft through the private network, so that you're not exposing your data to the public network. But if you are, if you do have a client VPN tunneling in, they have to come in through the internet. So that is a point of risk that is encrypted. It's a VPN secure connection, but every time you touch the public network, that's an area that needs extra scrutiny, right? So that's the advantage of private networking is you're never even touching the internet. But at those points that you do touch it, they're few and far between, because they're controlled locations designed for nothing but terminating tunnels. So you've got extra firewall rules for those termination points for added protection.
How do you, if it's a HIPAA-like environment or whatever, and you're using it over an Amazon cloud, how do you contain your data and control it? I mean, you're basically putting it on, you're basically releasing it to a public network. Even if it's a private network, it's still a public network, because they're having access to that data that is
Exactly.
not necessarily, so that
You're
in a
relying-
hospital environment just doesn't work.
Yeah, you're relying on the cloud provider to be the one that's adhering to that compliance, right? That level of
They'd have to
compliance.
adhere to that level.
Yeah, and all of the providers are moving in that direction. Microsoft has already announced that they're going to be HIPAA compliant, right? That they're providing separate infrastructures for that, and you can also do dedicated physical infrastructure with a lot of these cloud providers. So the options are all there, but it's absolutely a consideration.
I think you have to be very careful with HIPAA, because they say they're compliant, you read the fine print, and it's like, only if you do this, or we're HIPAA compliant, but you can't store HIPAA data. It's like.
Well, yeah.
That's the purpose.
Oh, yeah. And beyond that even is there's a lot of gray area with what the compliance rules dictate, right? It's not always just, you have to do this exact thing. It's just a set of guidelines that you have to decide as the person responsible, what's the best course of action. So sometimes that means you don't want to do cloud because you don't have complete or as close to complete control over top to bottom.
I think the other thing is you have to worry about data ownership. It comes down to a level, if it's sitting out on Amazon or Microsoft's cloud, and they could get in a legal argument over ownership.
Yeah, how do you get that out of there if you want to leave?
How do you get that out of there if you want to leave and you
Yep.
want to pull all your data?
Exactly.
So we are getting the hook. We will be here for more questions, but I want to thank all of you for coming and sharing your morning with us. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.